I'm Mike Brown, author, nerd, and host of the Dark Poutine podcast. Join me and Morgan Knudsen, author, paranormal researcher, and host of the TV shows Paranormal 911 and Haunted Hospitals every other Monday for our podcast, Supernatural Circumstances, as we take you on a journey for the curious about the unseen, the mysterious, and incredible things happening in the world about us. Check out Supernatural Circumstances wherever you listen to podcasts.
6:30 CHED Afternoons with Jaylen Nye. Weekdays at 2 on 6:30 CHED.
You know, the pandemic and what the world, the country, the province has gone through over the past 20 months. One of the things that is being discussed, but I think has been a little lost in the pandemic and what we've been dealing with over the past almost 2 years, is another crisis, and that is the opioid crisis in this country, in this province. Right now, Alberta, my friends, Alberta is on track to see its deadliest year for opioid deaths ever. The latest numbers that were released by the province on Friday show that on average, 4 people a day die from overdoses across Alberta. The numbers have been on the rise since May of 2020. That's when overdose deaths jumped about 45%. Since then, more than 100 people have died each month, and it's happening right across the province, in big communities, in small communities. When you take a look at the latest numbers, the city of Edmonton continues to see the highest number of drug poisoning deaths, with 59 reported in August. So just recently they put out the August numbers. In Calgary in August, there were 35 deaths. A total of 378 Edmontonians have died so far this year from drug poisoning, and 352 of those specifically from an opioid. 330 Calgarians have also died, including 296 from an opioid poisoning. Dr. Janetta Salvalaggio is the co-chair of Edmonton's Opioid Poisoning Committee. She joins us this afternoon. Doctor, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Hello.
Now, boy, oh boy, these numbers continue to be alarming, and I'm wondering if they're alarming to as many people as they should be. Janetta, I sometimes wonder if people think, hey, you know, it's not my world, it's not going to happen to me, it's not going to happen to my family, when the reality is that it's happening to people from all backgrounds, from all economic backgrounds, from all ethnicities, right across this province.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it should be very close to home, and I think one of the things we certainly see in the data that we'd like to highlight is, I mean, it's all ages, it's certainly all genders. We have these ideas about who it affects, but you know, it's hitting so many of our neighborhoods. It's hitting smaller centers. Yeah, and I mean, certainly some communities are impacted more than others, for sure. But there's no such thing as an area in our community that isn't affected one way or another.
Doctor, is there one thing that can be pinpointed as the root cause of this? Is it a toxic supply? Is it not having safe consumption sites? Is it a lack of treatment beds? Or is that the cumulative answer there? I mean, is there one thing?
I don't. I tend not to be a root cause thinker. I think there's so much to this. It's so complex, and it's so many people would like to say there's one solution. And I think there's just a lot that comes around to create this moment. One of the big things that certainly accelerated things is how toxic the drug supply is. But the drug supply is this toxic, you know, for a variety of reasons. One of which is just the overall policy direction over the past, you know, decade, admittedly, but if not further, and just the notion that these drugs are criminalized. There's been changes to prescribing practices. There's been some mental health concerns, but it's quite a few different things. I do worry a lot about the supply right now, though.
Yeah. When you look at the timeline of, these numbers that we're seeing, obviously the pandemic has played a role in this.
Yeah, although it's not the role that people assume it's taken. A lot of people would assume it's because of hard lockdowns, quote unquote. But I mean, actually, the spikes in drug poisoning deaths don't necessarily correlate with the strongest restrictions. For example, in the second and third waves, that didn't necessarily correlate with actual poisonings. So, I mean, it's not just about lockdowns, and I think people want to say that's what this is. It's about a lot more than that. I mean, it's the loss of safe spaces. So, rightfully so, we had to do some restrictions during the pandemic as far as physical distancing goes and so on. And that included in supervised consumption facilities. But there was really no additional funds, for example, to expand or adapt those services. And then meanwhile, we have health system overwhelm. So our ability to respond to a poisoning event is delayed. It's going to be delayed. So there's a lot of these things. What we have seen actually is that the upticks in poisoning counts, they tend to follow restricted access to a variety of services such as harm reduction. So, for example, the closure of Boyle Street earlier this year, their SCS, all of a sudden we saw an uptick in ambulance calls for this.
And I think that there's a couple safe consumption sites in Calgary that are closing and being moved as well. So there's some concern in Calgary as well. And I'm getting a number of texts coming in, and this one says, I've noticed a connection between people dying of overdose and attempts to restrict opioid prescription by doctors, and that forces people to go to the street. How much of a role does that play in this? Because I also understand that there has to be some rules and regulations too about prescribing opioids, and that has changed dramatically over the past 10, 20 years. But does that then lead to helping people wean themselves off and maybe not having the treatment or the access to the healthcare that they might need to, if they do get addicted in that way to an opioid, to recover from that safely?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people would like to solve this with this single notion that we're going to solve this through deprescribing or through the offering of treatment beds or so on. And it's not that simple. And what we do know actually that deprescribing, if it's rapid or involuntary, can actually lead to harm. There's some good data out there to suggest, that's going to cause mental health crises. It's going to cause an upswing in often fatal poisoning events. So we have to be very, very careful with the conversations around deprescribing, and they should only be done when somebody wants it done, and in a very gradual fashion. So
before I let you go, Doctor, I mean, we've had these conversations, and we continue to have these conversations. I think it's important to shine a light on these numbers, the fact that these numbers continue to go up, that we still have an obvious issue, a crisis in this province, in this country. We can keep talking, but is anyone listening? I guess that's my question. For what needs to be done, if that's increased, consumption sites, it's, maybe decriminalizing or looking at that, where's that conversation going?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can tell you what the conversation is in the front line and among people who are living this experience, living this moment. And the conversation is going to create safe spaces so we don't have to use alone. So that does mean expanding access to supervised consumption services, and not just virtual, but also in person. And it is about decriminalizing people's bodies and not criminalizing them for using drugs. And it also is about a safer supply so that people don't have to worry about what what the next moment is going to bring. And how do we get there? I think the public just needs to understand that these are potentially life-saving measures, and that we have to have a conversation. And it begins with those of us who vote in people who are in a position to change policy and change the direction of this crisis.
And we'll have to leave it there. I always appreciate your time, Dr. Salvalaggio. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Take care. Dr. Janetta Salvalaggio joining us this afternoon. Alberta, this province, on track to see its deadliest year for opioid deaths ever.